Well, hey everybody, thank you for checking in once again. And today we're going to talk about lenses, and specifically we're going to talk about 135mm lenses, and even more specifically than that, we're going to talk about 135mm vintage lenses and some of the choices that are out there that you can buy. A 135 lens will give you a little extra reach, in fact quite a lot of reach over a 50, which personally I quite often appreciate as a photographer. They'll give you lots of lovely background blur. They're natural blur makers. Even the slower f3.5 ones make plenty of blur, so they're great for portraits or any other situation where you want that little bit of magic in the back of the shot. And importantly, they're actually reasonably cheap. These are not particularly sought after lenses, especially the slower f3.5 ones, and you can find one of those from major manufacturers still even today for between, I would think, around 50 to 70 pounds, maybe less than that with patience. Now, just a note on the reach these lenses will give you. If you're using a full frame digital camera or a 35mm film camera, then they'll behave as a 135mm lens and they'll give you that focal length. If you put them on a smaller sensor camera, for example an APS-C camera, well then effectively, please do note that use of the word effectively, nothing magical happens, but because of the size of the sensor, effectively the lens focal length increases by around about a third, so that gives you even more reach. And if you put one of these lenses on a micro four thirds camera, then that effective focal length will actually double, so that will give you a very long lens indeed, like 270mm. Now, even though you do lose a little of the edge on smaller sensor cameras, I've used 135mm lenses on my Fuji APS-C cameras to great effect. I've used them a lot and I've made some nice images with them, and I don't really see any handicap in using them on smaller sensor cameras, and I certainly don't think that the image really loses anything to speak of. So I think these are great for all digital mirrorless cameras. All right, firstly I'm going to show you this lens. This is a lens I bought probably about 5 or 6 years ago. I think I paid maybe 10-15 pounds for it. This was at the time when vintage lenses were still very cheap. I've gone up a little bit since, and today you can buy a lens like this for about 40-50 pounds. It's the Ice Yena F35 electric multi-coated 135mm, and there you can see those beautiful Ice Yena coatings, and that's what, a part of what anyway, makes these lenses so special. And this is a very, very nice lens indeed, as are all the CZJ lenses. It's sharp at pretty much all apertures. It does get a little sharper as you stop it down, but it's a fairly slow lens to start with, so it does have some inherent sharpness. I've used it a lot and I've had a lot of fun with it. I've made a lot of nice images with it. This one, unfortunately, is, I don't know if you can see it, suffering from the Ice Yena curse, which is that the aperture has jammed, and I think I can see in there one of the blades has come slightly adrift. So that can happen to Ice Yena lenses. It's quite rare. It doesn't happen often. In fact, this is the only CZJ lens I've had it happen on, and I have had quite a lot of these. So unfortunately this one needs a little fixing, but it has been very reliable over the years. I don't think there's any particular problem as long as you keep that aperture dial turned. The CZJ lenses won't seize up, so give it a little turn once a week. Optically, it's just beautiful. It's got great colour, it's got great blur. It's an M42 mount, so it's a nice and easy mount for an M42 film camera, and you've probably already got an M42 adapter if you're used to using vintage lenses, so you won't need another one. And if you do need one, if you've not used M42s before, well, they're not very expensive. The adapters are not too expensive, so a good, useful, not quite universal, but very, very common mount to have. A very, very, very nice lens, one that's very well worth considering if you're looking for a nice CZJ 135. This is one of the nicest that you can get. Just remember to turn that aperture dial once a week to keep everything fit and healthy and in top condition. Now here's another lens that I've used quite often. This is the, you probably can already tell what it is from the colour of the markings. This is the Olympus OMZ 135mm. Again, it's an f3.5, so it's a relatively slow lens, but that's no real handicap in the days of digital mirrorless cameras. It was tricky in the film days because most people didn't really ever use film over 400 or certainly over 800 ISO, so light was at a premium. So in the film days, a lens like this was a good light lens. However, nowadays, when you can whack up the ISO on your digital camera to, gosh, 20 odd thousand and more, well, it doesn't really matter. And you can use a lens like this in most conditions that you'll encounter today. Even at night, they work pretty well if you turn up that ISO to the point where it needs to be. Now, this is a very beautiful little lens, and it is a little lens as well. Look, it's really small. Let me compare it to the CZJ, which is quite a bit taller. They're both fully retracted, so you can see that the CZJ is quite a bit taller and the Olympus really is a very, very small lens indeed, and that's one of the reasons that I appreciate it. Of course, most of the reason I appreciate it is because it makes great images, like almost all of the Zuiko lenses I've encountered. In fact, I think I'll amend that. I'm going to say all the Zuiko, OMZ lenses I've encountered. I've never yet encountered a lens that I would say isn't good or, has significant optical flaws. So these are very, very nice lenses, and this one is no exception. It gives very nice colour, it's very sharp, it gives beautiful background blur, so its optical qualities are fantastic. I've made many, many really nice shots with this lens, both on full frame and APS-C. I've used it a lot on my Fujifilm cameras. It has a little sliding lens hood, which is really handy. It's nicely machined, a nicely machined fit there onto the nose. So that's a really handy thing if you want to shield your lens. It saves you carrying a lens hood about, and it's really, just a little snack of a movement to bring it in and out. That's a big glass element there, and the sun is going to strike that at the wrong angle if you're not careful in the wrong lighting conditions. But this is a gorgeous lens, and it's a fairly cheap lens too. You can still buy these lenses for between 50 and 70 pounds, less if you're patient and you persevere on your favorite auction site. Yeah, so a really nice lens, pretty cheap, makes great images, very highly recommended from me. Another very nice 135 that I unfortunately don't have anymore, I sold it on, is the Konica AR Hexanon F3.2 135mm. Now, Konica made three, I believe, lenses in 135 AR Hexanon guise. If I'm correct, one was a 3.4, one was a 3.5, and one was a 3.2. And it's the 3.2 that is the most sought after and is said to make the nicest images. That is the overwhelming opinion that I've come across in research. The 3.2 is definitely the one to go for, and of course that will give you just that little bit more background blur. It'll open up just that little bit wider and it'll let in just that little bit more light, so you won't need to knock up your ISO quite so much if you're using this Konica lens in difficult or darker lighting conditions. Now, I'm a big fan of the AR Hexanon lenses, especially the later line from round about the mid-70s. Those are the nicest Konica lenses that I've encountered, and they really are lovely. This lens gives beautiful colour. It's a slightly lower contrast lens, certainly than the Olympus, but that's a nice look. I do like the lower contrast look, and this lens also makes very beautiful colours. Konica lenses were well known for the colours they could make back in the day, and they're still known for that by people who know about them now. So pretty much any Konica lens you get has great colour performance, certainly of the later AR Hexanon line, and this one is no exception. Colours are beautiful, contrast is low, but colours just come through beautifully. Nice and strong, not oversaturated, just right, just lovely. An absolutely lovely colour palette, and some very, very nice background blur as well. Perhaps even nicer than the CZJ and the Olympus. Perhaps that just that little bit nicer, with a little bit more smoothness, certainly some quirkiness still there that we expect from our vintage lenses, but a little bit more smoothness, slightly better behaved in many conditions. So a very, very nice lens, one that can be found again for between 50 and 70 pounds, probably less if you're patient and you persevere. Very highly recommended. Now, I think possibly the nicest 135mm lens I've used, possibly the nicest, is the Minolta MD135mm F28, and that's an exquisite lens. Minolta, like Konica, are well known for their colour performance. This one gives just magnificent colours. I've never really quite seen anything like the colours from this lens. It gives very beautiful background blur. Again, very smooth, still with the quirkiness that we expect from vintage lenses, still with the character that we expect from vintage lenses, but perhaps a little more grown up, perhaps a little more well behaved than some other vintage lenses, which can be a little bit wild from time to time. This Minolta makes beautiful, beautiful background blur. It will also make some really nice lens flares, which I do like. I know they're not everybody's cup of tea, but I think they can imbue a shot with a certain feel if it seems appropriate. It's a bit faster than the other lenses we've looked at so far at f2.8, so it will let in that little bit more light, meaning that you've got a little more freedom with your ISO dial, and it will also give you just that little bit more background blur. So if you want blur absolutely to the max, if you're doing a a shot that really needs some very, very large, very soft, very big billowy blur, this lens will give it to you. A very, very nice lens indeed, and possibly the nicest 135 I've ever shot. However, these are not quite as cheap as the other lenses that I've mentioned today. These lenses, from memory, I think are now going for around £60 to £100 or thereabouts. They have gone up a little bit recently in line with, well, most other things. But that's still not a big investment for a lens. And if you want a vintage lens that will really deliver the goods, then this 135 f2.8 from Minolta is very well worth considering. Right, now, as well as lenses from the major manufacturers, Olympus, Nikon, Canon, etc., there were also plenty of lenses from the cheaper manufacturers and third-party manufacturers as well. And I've got a couple of those here to show you. The first one is still in its box, proudly denoting its origin from Pentagon Objective. I think that's how you pronounce it. Do correct me if I'm wrong, apologies if I'm wrong. And as you may expect, this is the Pentagon Auto F2.8 135mm, and this lens too has a sneaky little extending hood, which is really handy if you're collecting scattered light that is reducing contrast and washing out your shot. It has an M42 mount at the back here, so it's a nice universal-ish mount. Well, if not quite universal, certainly very common. So that's the mount. Now, as for its optical performance, this is a reasonable lens, but I found that to get the best out of it, it did need to be stopped down a little. Wide open, it can display a little bit of chromatic aberration. Sometimes it can be a little soft. It's nice. It's not a bad look wide open, but it just isn't quite as tight and crisp as some more expensive lenses. Stop it down, however, to f3.5 and this lens becomes very much sharper and really begins to behave itself. The background blur is not overwhelming at f3.5, and it seems to take on a slightly nicer character as well. I'm not quite sure why that should be, but it does seem to behave itself a little more nicely. And of course it's that little bit sharper as well, and you get less chromatic aberration. So I think this lens is best considered as an f3.5 lens for most of its use, but you can open it up to f2.8 if the light is low or you really want that background blur. Now, given that this is slightly soft, this lens is slightly soft, wide open, I think it might make a really nice portrait lens. We don't always want portraits to be absolutely sharp. Sometimes we do want that little bit of softness in the shot. We need a soft feeling shot, depending on obviously who's being photographed. We often need a soft feeling shot, and this lens will give it to you very, very nicely indeed. But for general day-to-day use, I would stop it down to f3.5. The good news about this lens is that it's very cheap. You can buy one of these for £10 to £20, if that. They're not worth a lot of money, and they really are a very available lens if you want one of the cheaper varieties. However, this is only one cheap lens. There are plenty of others, and some of them are really, really nice, like this one. This is one of my nicest vintage lens finds. This is the Hanimex 135 2.8, and I did feature this lens on the show fairly recently, and I found it to be a very, very nice performer indeed. Hanimex did make some camera lenses, but back in the day they were best known for making slide projectors. I remember at school every slide projector had the name Hanimex on it, and they made overhead projectors, so all of those sorts of projectory type things. But of course those projectors involve lenses, and it didn't take long for them to begin making camera lenses, and this is a really, really nice one. I bought this lens for, I think it was it £5 or £10? It was very, very cheap anyway, and it's one of the nicest 135s I've shot. Whether in absolutely the final analysis it's technically as good as the CZJ135 or the Olympus or the Konica, I couldn't tell you, but what I do know is I don't see any difference just looking at the shots with my eye without pixel peeping or zooming in or looking for faults. So, you know, the overall impression, the overall look is very, very, very nice indeed. This lens makes beautiful colours, and they're just really vibrant and strong and saturated, and, you know, just how I like my colours actually. It really has a nice look. The background blur is really good. Sometimes it's all over the place and a little bit quirky, but it never gets so out of control that it becomes messy. And other times it can be really, really smooth and really, really nice. So a lens full of character, bursting with colour, nice and sharp from wide open. I ought to mention that. Obviously it gets sharper if you stop it down, but it is nice and sharp wide open. You can shoot this lens wide open and not get a soft image. So, you know, this is one of my better lens buys, and if you find one of these, you're looking for a nice 135 and you don't mind a third-party name on your camera, which I don't see there's any reason to, grab it. These are fantastic lenses. There are plenty of them about. Because they're third-party lenses, they don't go for much money. They're really, really cheap, and they're well worth buying if you see one. So there we are, 5 vintage 135 lenses, some f3.5, one f3.2 and a couple of f2.8s. They'll all give you a nice image, and the great thing about these lenses, as I've said, is they're not particularly sought after, so they're all reasonably cheap. Even the, you know, the big name ones are still relatively cheap to buy. So, you know, if you want a portrait lens, if you want a lens that'll give you plenty of blur, if you want a lens that'll give you that bit more reach, quite a lot bit more reach, in fact, grab one of these. They're well worth it. So I guess that's it from me for today. Many thanks for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope it's been useful. Many, many thanks to subscribers for your support. I really appreciate that. Many, many thanks also to patrons for your support. That is very, very much appreciated. Thank you for that. If you would like to support this channel and the work that it's doing, you can do that over at www.patreon.com/Zenography, and you can do that for as little as $1 per month. As for me, that's it for now. So if you're not doing anything too taxing or strenuous next week at around this time, please do tune in for a spot more Zenography. Cheerio all.